Hey guys, before we get into the show today, I wanted to let you in on a new project that Kevin and I have been working on. We're calling it the Vegan's Almanac. This is going to be a 5-minute daily show that highlights some good news in the world of veganism. And it will end with a moment of beauty, a prayer, a poem, a meditation, a hymn, something that will inspire you each day with the hope of God's kingdom of nonviolence. I know you're going to love making the Vegan's Almanac a beautiful part of your daily practice. We've been having so much fun putting it together. So stay tuned because the Vegan's Almanac is coming your way and it will be available wherever you get your podcasts. And now, on with the show. I agree with you. I obviously agree that humane slaughter is an oxymoron. I'm going to kindly kill you. I'm going to kindly end your life against your will. But at the same time, we know that human beings and their wickedness can prolong an animal's death, can torture an animal. And the fact that God is saying, don't do that,
right.
I will not allow you to do that, is still, I think, a demonstration that God is kind and cares about animals.
No, it's a great point that, again, God is making concessions. He's saying, okay, fine. Go ahead, kill these animals, but do it this way to minimize the suffering. There's still suffering, but let's minimize it as much as possible. Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology, episode 32 with Kevin and Sarah Hale.
Hello, listeners. Thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. Last episode was about us familiarizing ourselves with animal sacrifice in the ancient Near East. What was it all about? Why were they doing it? Which was really interesting. And we were asking the question, did Yahweh command animal sacrifice to be done by the Israelites? Or was it purely a cultural import that they just continued on? Or was it a little of both, a concession that God allowed to continue or tolerated,
Right.
or even tried to redefine or reform?
Yep.
We're going to continue to have that question in the back of our minds as we continue through our series on animal sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
But we are going to turn our attention fully to Old Testament animal sacrifice now. And in order to do that, we're going to be spending some time with the book Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death by Andrew Remington Rillera. And we're still at the beginning stages of reading this book. It's really, really good. I love how practical they make it.
Right.
If I had to summarize Rillera's thesis, I think it's something along the lines that our misunderstandings of Old Testament sacrifice have led to a lot of bad stuff.
Right.
Have led to misunderstandings of God's character, have led to misunderstandings of the death of Jesus, and have led to misunderstandings of how we as Christians should be showing up in the world.
Right. And just salvation and what actually happens in Jesus' death on the cross. And at the end of the day, if we don't properly understand what Old Testament sacrifice was all about, that's going to skew our understanding of sacrifice, that or certain words that are used, which we'll get into in the New Testament by Paul and other writers, and how we might be injecting the wrong meaning into our understanding, in essence, our exegesis of the New Testament, our interpretation. So that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've said this from the get-go, that our goal as theologians is to minimize bad theology and heresy.
Yeah.
And so,
and they do a really good job from page 1 on of really making it clear this is not just some theoretical exercise of a finer point of doctrine that we should probably get right. They make it really clear that no, the implications are far-reaching,
Right.
including our politics and our criminal justice system, and even supporting things like the death penalty. And it all can be supported by maybe a misunderstanding of Old Testament sacrifice.
Absolutely.
Let's get into it. Starting with the introduction, I wanted to talk about the title and his explanation for it. I think I mentioned last episode that when I first read the title, I was, what is this? What, some patriotic pop theology book? Lamb of the Free. But once I read his explanation, I actually like the title. He says, the title, Lamb of the Free, is an intentional, if unclever, pun on the self-conception and identity the United States projects into the world in its national anthem as the land of the free and the home of the brave. My aim is ultimately to showcase the liberating message of the gospel as an act of resistance to other notions of, quote, freedom on offer in the world, as represented in the U.S. national anthem. So I really resonate with that. I think that we just don't even have a full understanding of the kind of freedom that God wants all of creation to have.
Right.
The kind of freedom that is within the gospel message. And it's a good reminder that we actually need to resist these other notions on offer. The freedom that the world offers, even the freedoms that the United States offers,
Right.
pale in comparison to the freedom that God is offering.
Right.
Secondly, in the introduction, he brings up a very interesting point of how did we get here? How do Christians end up having very, very wrong understandings of Old Testament sacrifice? It comes down to a translation error, partly.
Right.
Like that's what got it all started.
English translations. Right.
He explains that way back in the 1300s, we're going back to the 14th century when John Wycliffe was translating the New Testament into English for the first time. When he was translating the Greek word katalasso, which means reconciliation, right? He used an English phrase, at one-ment, or to become one.
To become reconciled, I guess.
Yes, to be at one with God. And that's all fine and good. We fast forward to the 16th century now, the 1700s, where we find William Tyndale pushed that phrase together to create a new word. So instead of using it as a phrase, at one-ment, or at one, he pushed it into one word, which is atonement. That's where we get the word in English. It means at one. And that still is kind of all fine and good. No real problems there. That, whatever Jesus did on the cross made us at one with God again.
Right.
Reconciled us to God. That's all great. The problem is that Tyndale then takes this word, atonement. He used the word atonement to translate texts in the Old Testament in Leviticus that spoke of sacrifices and sacrificial acts. He was using the word atonement for the Hebrew word kippur, or we sometimes pronounce kippur.
Yeah, and that word really, it means like to purge or purify, to cleanse, to decontaminate. And so they're not quite the same word. It's not the same word as reconciliation.
Exactly.
But he throws this in the translations, the word atonement, in these Old Testament passages for kippur.
Yes. So he's conflating these differing concepts into the same thing, which is where Christians read that and they think, oh, these Old Testament Israeli animal sacrifices were making the people at one with God. We're reconciling people to God. There was a reconciling power in these animal sacrifices. And that one error has set our theology on the train tracks of some really poor places.
Yeah, some bad theology.
Right.
So yeah, I think what the goal of his chapter 1 is to, and these next 4 chapters in his book, I think, are meant to give us a good understanding of what Old Testament sacrifice is. Chapter 1, he's essentially saying, understanding Old Testament sacrifice, what it is not.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I think at first our intention was, let's just use this book for those 4 chapters that really clarify what is going on in the Old Testament animal sacrifices. Let's use just that for our purposes. But as we read this book so far, it has become, I think, clear to me at least, that we do need to just go ahead and read the whole book and allow him to make his argument in full. I think it's going to be well worth our time.
Right.
Because what he's really going after is a theory of atonement called penal substitutionary atonement. And that has definitely influenced our theology as we have grown up in the faith.
Right.
And it's going to be well worth our time to really get clear on what that theory claims and its implications on our life.
Right.
And look at some other theories of atonement that might actually be more faithful.
Right. That might be more faithful to the text and also better for everyone, humanity and the kingdom of God, really.
More faithful to the character of God.
Right.
It doesn't misrepresent God, perhaps.
Right. And then we're stuck with these contradictions we're all trying to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Right.
In building this foundation that we've been trying to build of a vegan theology, I really am excited for how this book is going to help us.
Right.
With
No,
that.
I agree.
We're going to be making this book our home for the next few episodes.
Nice.
Okay, so yeah, exactly as you said, Kevin, this first chapter is the negative argument, I guess you would say, which is what Old Testament sacrifice is not. That's where we're starting. And it's going to be interesting to look at what we learned with our last episode in terms of what was animal sacrifice to the ancient mind and contrast that with what we have superimposed on Old Testament animal sacrifice that really should not be there.
Among conservative Protestant Christians, penal substitutionary atonement is probably the dominant theory of atonement. I was just thinking about it too as we were reading this. Like if we didn't know any theology whatsoever and we were just going to church, and I think what we grew up with and our understanding is that this concept of substitution, that Christ died on the cross, he sacrificed himself, but he did as a substitution for us. And we just automatically translate that back to what's happening in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I don't even think we think about it. We just do it.
Right.
I think that's our understanding.
If you remember in our last episode, I was like, okay, this is, I think, how I understood animal sacrifice in the Old Testament as a young Christian. Okay, it was like an object lesson. God wants to really impress upon humans that sin is so horrible that someone has to die. Blood has to be shed, right? I guess what was implicit in my explanation, but I didn't really consciously think about it, or I certainly didn't say it explicitly, was that animal that we're allowing to die for our sin, that blood that's being shed, is a substitute for us.
Right.
As in, God demands death if you sin.
Right.
But God is kind enough to say, okay, you don't have to be killed. This animal has to be killed in your place.
Right.
That's part of our understanding of how we see penal substitutionary atonement onto Old Testament sacrifice.
Right.
Okay, well, Rillera comes right out of the gate in chapter 1 with a very bold claim that, number 1, Old Testament sacrifice is not about substitutionary death. He says there is no such thing as a substitutionary death sacrifice in the Torah.
Wow.
I feel like I need to say it one more time.
Right.
There is no such thing as a substitutionary death sacrifice in the Torah. Here are some of his arguments. Number 1, whenever something calls for capital punishment, okay, or for the sinner to be, quote, cut off, there is no sacrifice that could be made to rectify the situation. If you want to look at that, that's Numbers 15 and Numbers 35. If somebody does something so egregious that it demands capital punishment or for them to be cut off from the people, there is no sacrifice that can remedy that situation. This already rules out the idea that the death of the sacrificial animal is substituting for the death of the offerer.
Right. Logically, that makes sense.
Repeat that back to me in your own words.
If there is a capital offense,
Yeah.
there is no sacrifice that is worthy enough to compensate for the crime.
He goes on to explain if, quote, substitutionary death was the logic of animal sacrifice, then the one thing we could expect to be remedied by sacrifice would be capital offenses when the death of the offender is on the line. The fact that this is explicitly not the case means we need to rethink the Old Testament sacrificial system and to analyze the New Testament sacrificial metaphors with this in mind. Again, if we remember, how did the ancient person perceive sacrifice? It was not, oh God, I'm killing this animal to you. Please forgive my sins.
Right.
That was not at all the ancient religion.
Right.
It was, oh, we are the God's slaves, and to make God happy, we feed them.
Right.
We kill these animals and offer it to the gods for their food.
Right.
I think that here we're seeing that even what's happening in the Old Testament is still very consistent with the ancient mind. His second point, when he is arguing sacrifice is not about substitutionary death, point number 2, it is not as if God desires human blood on the altar, but settles for animal blood instead. In fact, human blood on the altar or in the temple does just the opposite of what sacrificial animal blood does. Rather than purging the sancta from pollution, human blood defiles it, even if it is the blood of sinners who, quote, deserve death. The idea that human blood on the altar is a sacrilege precedes the priest-prophet Ezekiel by centuries. This is why clinging to the altar was a common ancient way to claim asylum. You can see that in Exodus 21. Nobody would dare to defile the altar by shedding human blood upon it, even if it was the blood of a person guilty of murder. The guilty person needs to be taken away from the altar before being put to death. This is why Adonijah, Solomon's older half-brother and eldest living heir of David at the time, grabs hold of the horns of the altar for safety. The idea is that Solomon would not dare kill Adonijah next to the altar because his blood would then be all over the altar, desecrating it. So point number 1, even when the death of the offender is required, there is no sacrifice that can remedy that situation.
Right.
Point number 2, it's not like God really wants human blood, but he just settles for animal blood.
Right.
He never ever wanted human blood at all.
Right.
And then point number 3, according to the Old Testament, the God of Israel abhors human sacrifice. It is the pinnacle of false worship. Logically, then, the atoning blood of atoning sacrifices cannot be construed as substituting for the death or the blood of the offerer. There is no warrant anywhere in the Old Testament that through animal sacrifice, God is accepting animal blood on the altar instead of the ostensibly more ideal human blood. The notion that Levitical sacrifice is a ritual of substitutionary death is an altogether foreign concept. This idea simply needs to be substituted with something more congruent with the biblical texts.
Wow.
So that's his argument against the sacrifice being a substitute for the human. Now, some people might ask, why did the Old Testament say that the offerer had to lay a hand on the animal?
Right.
Some people have interpreted that as when you lay your hand on the animal that's to be sacrificed, it's saying, now this animal is going to die on my behalf.
Right.
And he's going to explain that is a misunderstanding. And he says, notice that the, quote, well-being sacrifices, so there's such a thing in the Old Testament as something called well-being sacrifices, Leviticus 3, which have no atoning function because they have nothing to do with sins, are one of the sacrifices that require a single hand-laying gesture. This means the single hand gesture cannot be understood as substitutionary death or transferring sin or whatever else, because sin is excluded from view for these non-atoning well-being sacrifices. Moreover, as Scott Schaff notes, these well-being offerings are made on joyous occasions and have nothing to do with atonement. For these sacrifices, the idea that the animal's life substitutes for the life of the offerer does not even make sense.
Right.
Additionally, the guilt offering, which is one of the atoning sacrifices, does not require a hand gesture. These two offerings prove that whatever the single hand gesture means, it cannot mean substitutionary death or transfer of sin. The non-atoning well-being offering requires the hand gesture, whereas the atoning guilt offering does not.
Right. And he kind of says the hand gesture is more of a sense of ownership. I'm sacrificing this animal. Because sometimes he would say that if there was a larger animal, it might take a few men to like bring it to the altar. Or if a gentleman was bringing an animal to the altar for a woman, it was just to let the priest know, whoever laid their hand on the animal when it was time to offer the sacrifice, that was the person that was bringing it. So to differentiate several people bringing an animal to the altar.
It was a clarifying gesture of the one bringing this animal is me.
Right.
Belongs to me.
I own it. Yes.
Right.
There was also laying of two hands as well.
Two hands is a designation, whereas one hand is ownership. What does the hand gesture mean then? Quite simply, it is a gesture of ownership. The single hand gesture is distinguished from the double hand gesture, which occurs on the Day of Atonement, although only upon the goat that is not sacrificed and remains alive. Drawing on the biblical and ancient Near Eastern sources, David P. Wright argues that the two-handed rite conveys a notion of designation, as when Moses appoints Joshua as his successor. Therefore, our misunderstanding about what the hand laying means has been cleared up.
Right.
For sure. Okay, sacrifice is not about substitutionary death. His second argument of what Old Testament sacrifice is not is that Old Testament sacrifice is not about death. Now, we got into this little passage of this chapter last episode. I just couldn't help myself because it was really helpful and informative on helping us understand the connections between the ancient Near East and the Israelites. This is where he talks about the power of ritual.
Right. And just to clarify, which I think is fascinating in this whole thing, because it really comes down to culture. But like you said, it's not about death. It's actually about life, which is kind of funny, right?
Yes. We made the argument, partly with the support of this book, but other sources last time, that the ancient person had a sense of guilt and shame about killing an innocent animal. And one of the ways that they alleviated that guilt and shame was by turning it into a religious ritual in which they're actually offering the animal back to God. It's a presentation of life back to God. And this helped them to sanctify, I guess, the act of killing.
Right. It sounds twisted.
Yes. I don't know that we really talked about how twisted this sounds last time. And maybe we should just take a second because, Rillera even talks about how ancient hunting-gathering societies would have ritual around when they killed an animal through hunting, right? And I think, of course, we can be gracious because I think we still do this in modern day. We ritualize things to take away the ugliness of something. So I know that we're not blameless in this area. But when you're reading this, when a hunter, or in the case of the sacrifice, the offerer, when they are like, oh, I'm not killing you and I'm letting you go back home to the Creator, it does give you kind of a gross feeling.
Right.
And it reminds me, if an abuser is saying to the victim, God has given me permission to abuse you, or I'm so thankful to you and I'm so thankful to God for giving you to me to do this to, the abuse or harassment or murder or whatever, that's spiritual abuse.
Right.
It's really disgusting. It's spiritualizing a heinous act.
Right.
And to the ancient person, maybe this was the best they could do. At least they had some guilt and shame over killing animals that they wanted to alleviate. Whereas today we've convinced ourselves there's nothing to feel guilty about.
Right. Yeah. If they felt guilt and shame, then they came up with this justification and they spiritualized it. We feel like culture anthropologists as we're reading this because it's a different culture. It's a different time. When we read it, it doesn't seem to fit very nicely. It's not clean. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't make social sense. It doesn't sit well. Let's put it that way. It's strange that this is the justification. It just doesn't seem to fit with God's character. And yet we have these commands, these laws that God has prescribed in terms of how you're going to deal with animals. I just want to say that what we're about to read, this justification, this argument, this ritual concept, this cultural concept that's been spiritualized, does not seem to match God's character. And so, yeah, concession would be the right word. God is somehow allowing this with his people for now. And also, it could say something about the actual text itself, about who wrote it, how inspired it is. And again, we come from a conservative background, so that's not necessarily easy to question the text. But then when we find things like this, it doesn't match up with God's character. So we have to somehow deal with that.
Yeah. As I try to think about how is our culture similar in terms of ritualizing violence and making it seem benign.
Right.
I don't know if this is a good equivalent or not, but one thing that came up is maybe we get together as friends and family for the Super Bowl, and there's a spread laid out of ribs and chicken wings and hot dogs and whatever. And instead of seeing the murder of many, many innocent creatures of God, we see, community and fun and celebration. And this is the stuff that makes life worth living. These opportunities to get together and have a fun day together.
Right.
Or a 4th of July barbecue, same thing. We gather around the grill as a family while there's dead cows and dead pigs and dead chickens who really did not do anything to deserve their death.
Right.
But instead of seeing the gruesomeness of these corpses, we see family and patriotism, and we ritualize all this positive stuff.
Well, so many things like hunting animals. I'm sure a young hunter gets ritualized into killing an animal. And I would even, for some reason, the idea of a hazing in certain colleges and fraternities and some of the armed forces academies. There are all these hazing rituals within these organizations, and they can get very deranged and violent at times. Yeah, we do all kinds of strange things, and we ritualize it as some part of coming of age, some cultural process.
And it's a bonding experience.
And now you're a man. And ironically, you mentioned the NFL, Super Bowl. Not only you're talking about the animals, but the sport itself, that contact sport. We're learning that so many players are getting injured with this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. That's just a whole nother thing. We even need to question that sport. Any kind of contact sport like that, UFC or whatever it is. So again, this is where we talk about being consistent in our ethic, nonviolent. You got to think about that.
So this whole section where he's saying that Old Testament sacrifice is not about death, and that's all through the power, the cultural power of the ritual. Through ritual, this is no longer a killing. This is no longer a murder. This is no longer anything bad. This has now, through ritual, become something beautiful.
Something life-giving.
Yes, we are offering a life to God. It's not seen as a death, which, even though I've read this a few times, still is hard to get my mind around.
It is.
But that's the thing about culture, right?
Right.
To the outsider, it can seem insane. To the insider, it resonates. And
makes total sense.
Makes total sense. Yeah. He goes on to say that it's very clear that the sacrifice is not about the killing. It's not about the death, because it's really about what happens to the animal's body after he or she has been killed.
Right.
Supporting this view is the fact that the death of the animal, the slaughter itself, is given no ritual or theological meaning by any biblical text. Scott Schaff's incisive observation about the role of the priest as opposed to the offerer in Leviticus 4 makes this clear. Note that the slaughter of the animal is mentioned only in verse 29. The great part of the ritual focuses on what is to be done with the different parts of the animal after he or she is killed. This means that ritualized killing is not the purpose of cultic sacrifices in the Hebrew Bible, and killing alone does not qualify a given set of activities as a sacrifice. So just killing the animal doesn't count as a sacrifice. You haven't made it a sacrifice at that point. The fact that sacrificial killing involves accessing blood means that something other than death for death's sake, he uses the phrase death qua death, is being activated. As Moffat puts it, the blood is the vehicle or agent of the victim's life. And the converse of this point is that the death or slaughter of the victim, while necessary to procure the blood, has no particular atoning significance in and of itself. And then he says, a bloodless breaking of the animal's neck or some such would suffice as a sacrifice if all that mattered was the death of the animal. However, breaking an animal's neck is a non-sacrificial slaughter.
Wow.
The actual ritual, the actual sacrifice import dwells within what happens to the body after the killing. And he goes on to say, this indicates that the burning of the sacrificial material is the main ritual element to be carried out, which is why vegetable and grain offerings are sacrifices, even though there's obviously no slaughter happening there.
Right.
So this ritual is not about killing. This ritual is not about death. In terms of the Old Testament understanding, it's not about substituting for your sins, and it's not even about dying. Then his third point is Old Testament sacrifice is not about suffering.
This is what I find fascinating about culture. If you don't kill the animal in the right place, at the right time, with the right person involved, with a ritual, then it doesn't count as a sacrifice. It's murder.
Right.
Which is just so crazy to me. Because what if you, again, I brought this up last time, what if you wanted to do your own little ritual by yourself in your home? You can't. This is also what we alluded to in the last podcast. This is how the priests and the civic government controls all of this. They control the meeting out of the meat, or they control all of it.
This fact that it's not considered a killing, and it's all about the ritual of what happens to the animal after the killing, that, again, to me, lines up more with what all the ancient people understood with their sacrifices. We're seeing a lot of parallels culturally. Another way is that the Bible handles what to do when you go out and you hunt game and you kill through hunting. So these are not considered animal sacrifices to God. This is something else. And as you remember from last episode, the whole world of hunters and gatherers had these spiritual rituals to sanctify the killing when they went hunting.
Right.
That's the same in the Old Testament. And it was specifically about what happens to the animal's blood. Leviticus 17 ends with instructions for hunting clean game. Importantly, the instruction is not just about not consuming blood, which we got from Genesis 9 after the flood, but also specifies that certain actions with the blood need to take place. Otherwise, the hunters are liable to be cut off. The blood needs to be A, poured out, and B, covered with dirt. As William K. Gilders asks and responds, but why is the blood disposed of in this specific way? Clearly, we have to do with ritualized activity here. That is, the text prescribes a definite mode of dealing with the blood, which differs from the normal and casual disposal of other waste products from a slaughtered animal, such as the excrement in the digestive tract or the bones. This next part is so interesting, too. In fact, Deuteronomy borrows from the logic of handling the blood from hunted game in Leviticus 17 in order to deal with the new reality that Israelites who now live in the promised land and live so far away from the centralized sanctuary and altar would never be permitted to eat from their flocks and herds, since the meat from these can only be eaten when they are offered as well-being sacrifices at the sanctuary, per Leviticus 17. When they received the laws in Leviticus, they were still on Exodus. They were still in the presence of the tabernacle. They could always have access to sanctifying the killing of their herds through sacrifice, doing it the right way.
Right.
Once they reach the promised land, and they're really spread out, becomes impractical and impossible to trek all the way to the temple every time you wanted to kill an animal. So Deuteronomy says, okay, we're just going to deal with it the way that we were taught to deal with hunted game in order to sanctify it. Living too far away from the dwelling place makes journeying there unfeasible anytime the Israelites wanted to eat meat. And so Deuteronomy stipulates that eating meat from the flock and herds can be treated in the same way Leviticus 17 deals with hunted game. Deuteronomy only specifies pouring out of the blood on the ground and lacks the additional activity of covering it from Leviticus 17. Nevertheless, As Gilders observes, the deliberate act of not doing anything with the blood except disposing of it by pouring it out on the ground is ritualized activity, since it is strategically distinguished from another assumed type of activity and a privileged opposition is established. In this way, the necessary biological death of a herd or flock animal for a meal in Deuteronomy is no longer a killing or a homicide, but neither is it a sacrifice. It just becomes a non-killing meal.
Wow.
Like hunted game.
Mm. See, that to me is so interesting because that again plays into the human side of this text. It plays into the human side of this text, and it plays into God making concessions for his people. That right there, to me, demonstrates it. It became impractical, and so we had to make this concession. We had to rewrite the rules a little bit to accommodate our people in the promised land.
It begs the question also, did God even want a temple?
Right.
Or were they just copying their neighbors?
Right.
It also brings up for me, people love to point out God gave us permission to kill and eat animals after the flood. Yes, he did. But clearly there's all these rules and it's a qualified permission and there's all these consequences if you do it the wrong way.
Right.
None of that existed when he said, eat all the plants.
Right. Yeah, there were no qualifications in Genesis 1:29.
Right.
Also interesting, I just want to point out, because you talked about the temple, at the end of the day, and we have biblical theological text from G.K. Beale, who basically is saying that Eden, in essence, was a temple. And I think we said this in our earliest podcasts. And that the idea is we as stewards were to spread Eden around the globe, to spread God's temple. And we also know in Revelation 21, when we get into the eternal state, the New Jerusalem will come down to earth and God's presence will be emanating from the temple, and the temple being the New Jerusalem. And again, we would expand it, I believe, just like we would Eden. So very interesting.
Yes. All right. So just to recap, sacrifice is not about substitution. Sacrifice is really not even about the death. And then 3, he points out, Old Testament sacrifice is not about suffering. Let's take a look at that. Not only is sacrifice separated from having anything to do with the concept of death, it is also separated from the notion of suffering. As David Moffat explains, quote, to maltreat a sacrificial animal would be to render he or she ineligible to be offered to God, since a sacrificial victim that suffered physical damage from abuse would no longer be without blemish. Hence, the attempt to read suffering and the centrality of death back into Jewish sacrifices leads to all manner of misunderstanding about sacrifice as Leviticus portrays it. Sacrificial slaughter was meant to be painless, quick, and humane by means of a swift cut to the throat. In fact, rabbinic instructions for animal slaughter, building on the basic notions for humane animal slaughter in the Torah, demonstrates how foreign the notion of suffering is to the animal slaughter, let alone animal sacrifice, because every effort is made to preclude suffering taking place. Just as animals that cannot be sacrificed nevertheless have a ritual means of transforming their necessary deaths for a meal into a non-killing / non-murder in Leviticus 17. The Hebrew word is shahita, which is the right way to slaughter animals, transforms what could be considered suffering from an outsider's perspective, because the death of an animal may be comprehended as inherently involving suffering, into a non-suffering and painless event from an insider's perspective by stipulating how all the various aspects before, during, and after the slaughter are to be done so that the animal does not suffer pain. Once again, we encounter the transformative power of ritual activity. So as Moffat highlights in the Torah, there is no hint that the animal is made to suffer, nor that the victim is an object of abuse or wrath. Inflicting suffering on the sacrificial victim is not a part of the biblical sacrificial system.
Wow.
And of course, that is significant because of how we have seen the sacrifice around Jesus' death in the
Right.
New Testament, and we will definitely be coming back. But he points out that when Jesus' suffering and his death are the topic in the New Testament, in those contexts, sacrificial metaphors are avoided. When Paul or the other writers of the epistles or the early church talk about the suffering of Jesus, the suffering that Jesus went through in his execution, they don't use sacrificial metaphors.
Interesting. Very interesting. It has to be said at some point, but here we are talking about humane killing, right? And you can't help but notice this here in the text. You've got the Old Testament in an attempt to justify humane killing, and it's kind of funny because now we know that that's an oxymoron, humane killing. And we just saw a lecture by Will Tuttle on the Christspiracy community, and he was bringing up a word in one of his lectures, adrenochrome or adrenochrome. And it's something to do with the fact that when an animal is about to be killed and it knows it's about to be killed and it's struggling to survive and it's got all this adrenaline pumping through its system and all these hormones, and then you kill it, that adrenaline and the cortisols and all those hormones get laced throughout the meat. We're eating that death meat, in essence. We're eating those chemicals. The fact that something like adrenochrome exists says something to the fact that there is no such thing. I already know this, but there is no such thing. That's a physiological response.
Yeah.
This is an animal trying to survive, and yet it's flooding its system with all these different hormones to try and survive, and then we end its life.
Yeah.
And so these chemicals are still in the meat.
I agree with you. I absolutely, obviously agree that humane slaughter is an oxymoron. I'm going to kindly kill you. I'm going to kindly end your life against your will. But at the same time, we know that human beings and their wickedness can prolong an animal's death, can torture an animal. And the fact that God is saying, don't do that,
Right.
I will not allow you to do that, is still, I think, a demonstration that God is kind and cares about animals.
No, it's a great point that, again, God is making concessions. He's saying, okay, fine. Go ahead, kill these animals, but do it this way to minimize the suffering. There's still suffering, but let's minimize it as much as possible.
Yeah.
It's not the final word. And I think many Christians might read something in the text and be like, oh, see, this is allowed. We're allowed to do this.
Yeah.
It's what God wants.
We just watched Pignorant, Joey Carbstrong's documentary about how so many pigs are killed through gas chambers. And he's having these conversations with the people in charge of these companies. And they're like, yeah, we know it causes a huge amount of suffering. We don't know the way to kill these animals without causing suffering. So right now it's the best we can do.
Right.
And he's like, well, if you know it causes suffering, how about we just stop killing them for now?
Right.
There is no way to end an animal's life without causing their suffering.
Correct. No, but what a concession. At least they're saying, well, yeah, we know there's no way to kill an animal without suffering, but we still need our bacon, so we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And when you guys come up with something good, let us know.
Yeah.
I think we're just going to read the conclusion to this chapter. I think it's really succinct. And again, you can always get your hands on a copy of Lamb of the Free by Andrew Remington Rillera. So here we go. Israel makes a big deal about blood guilt, and as we will see soon enough, not even the Day of Atonement can atone for it. Leviticus 17:3-5 says that killing and eating a domesticated animal is considered killing/murder, and thus incurs blood guilt upon the person. The only way for this not to be killing/murder is if the animal is sacrificed at the dwelling place and its blood is placed in some fashion in relation to the altar. This transforms the death of the animal into a sacrifice, and thus the offerer is not guilty of bloodshed. At the end of the day, it is crucial to realize that the Torah explicitly reconceptualizes the death of the sacrificial animal into a non-killing. This explains why the Torah does not give the death of the animal itself any ritual or theological significance, and this all thereby proves that there simply is no warrant for the view that the sacrifice is standing in for the death of someone who is ostensibly worthy of death. This is because A, the death of a sacrificial animal is explicitly not to be recognized as shedding blood, and thus logically cannot be understood as substituting for shedding the blood of the offerer. And B, there is no sacrifice, not even the Day of Atonement, that can be made to substitute for when someone is to be put to death or cut off. Any way we come at this, the Levitical sacrificial system was not about substituting for someone who was supposed to be put to death, let alone substituting for someone else's deserved suffering.
This is challenging in terms of how do we reframe Jesus' death on the cross.
Right.
I could feel the discomfort rise in me as wait, what does this mean? What are you trying to take away from my theology?
Right. But I think that's also why we need to follow this with a look at the Christus Victor view of atonement.
Yeah.
And I think once we do, we're going to see that it is not anthropocentric and that it represents every part of creation.
Yeah.
Animals, the earth, humans.
Yeah. I can see how these concepts, because they're butting up against entrenched beliefs,
Right.
might take a while to sink in.
Right.
I wanted to wrap up this episode, go back to what he is proposing. So if he's saying penal substitutionary atonement is not the way we should understand our salvation or the gospel, I wanted to read a little passage where I think he's starting to hint at something better. He says, Jesus' death is a participatory phenomenon. It is something all are called to share in experientially. The logic is not, Jesus died so we don't have to. Rather, it is, Jesus died so that we together can follow in his steps and die with him and like him, having full fellowship with his sufferings, so that we might share in the likeness of his resurrection. And he's pulling that from Philippians, Galatians, Romans, 1 Peter, Mark, and 1 John. In short, while Jesus did die for us, this does not mean that Jesus died instead of us. It means that he died ahead of and with us. This is why I find substitution to be inadequate, incoherent, and inherently misleading as a summarizing conceptualization of the saving significance of Jesus' death in the New Testament. As a former college ministry pastor and now an undergraduate professor, I have seen first and second hand how much destruction is caused by Christians because their essentialized substitutionary framework prevents them from even wanting to be conformed and transformed into the cruciform image of Christ. Substitutionary frameworks, whether intentionally or not, corrode the logic of Christian discipleship among everyday Christians. Substitution makes conformity to the cruciform image of Christ incoherent. If Jesus is my substitute, why do I need to take up a cross? Why do I need to have fellowship with his sufferings? Why do I need to be co-crucified? The church itself is hamstrung in the pursuit of God's kingdom justice by being beholden to warped notions of justice based on penal substitutionary atonement.
Wow.
So I'm excited.
Strong words there.
I'm excited to get a better understanding of these different theories of atonement.
Well, I think what it is too is once we do have a better understanding, the way we read the New Testament is going to be completely different.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be had here.
Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and this is complex stuff. You can always get a copy and read along, and you can follow along with what we're saying. We're doing our best to try and make sense of it in summary fashion. So thanks for listening.
What Old Testament animal sacrifice is not. And next week, what Old Testament animal sacrifice is.
Right. Catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Later.